Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Nolan Higdon, a political analyst, author, host of the Disinfo Detox podcast, lecturer at Merrill College and the Education Department at University of California, Santa Cruz, and Project Censored Judge. Higdon's popular Substack includes the biweekly Gaslight Gazette, which chronicles important and well-researched examples of disinformation, character assassination, and censorship in the United States. Higdon's areas of concentration include critical AI literacy, podcasting, digital culture, new media history and propaganda, and critical media literacy. He's the author of The Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news literacy education, Let's Agree to Disagree, a critical thinking guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy, and Surveillance Education, Navigating the Conspicuous Absence of Privacy in Schools. Higdon is a founding member of the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas and a regular source of expertise for CBS, NBC, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle. I welcome Nolan Higdon to Savage Minds. There's so much to discuss, Nolan, and what is going on. And I've been following your recent commentary between social media and, of course, your work, both on your podcast and in writing. I don't even know a best place to begin because when Maduro and Flores were kidnapped, I thought this year is going to be crazy. And who would have thought that that was the easier part of the last, how many days are we into 2026? So I think maybe a good place to start would be the least obvious, but maybe to you, the more obvious, Jeffrey Epstein, and what this means for systemic corruption within not only global politics, to a very large degree, Western politics, and the United States specifically. You argue that Jeffrey Epstein was not an aberration, but a representative of a larger system. How does media focus on his scandalous crimes to avoid discussing the deeper issues here? The financial machinery. Many pundits have theorized, some have partially proven that he had a blackmailing operation going on as well. All this secrecy around his links to the State of Israel and their spying agency. Could you begin maybe by talking about the aberration myth?
Yeah, and I take your point about how it seems like Epstein has nothing to do with Venezuela or Iran, but I think there is a connection there, and it's an interesting week to have this conversation because a poll just came out that a majority of Americans believe that distracting from Epstein was at least part of the reason Trump started this war with Iran. And it does seem like, we call in the United States called Donald Trump the Teflon Don, and it's meant to be that like just scandals that would take down another president just bounce right off him. They're just forgotten within days. Where other presidents would, totally go down. I mean, just go back to 2016 with the like grab him by the pussies tape. That would have taken down any other politician, or just the racist, sexist things Trump has said, or the international disasters he's caused would take him down. But Trump is really strong, but one of the few issues that has really weakened him has been the Epstein case. It's somewhat an unforced error by his administration. They had promised to be transparent, tapping into the widespread belief that Democrats were corrupt, and not that that was a difficult case to make, but the he promised transparency, and his online following really believed part of that was going to be the release of the Epstein files, which if you weren't in the online world prior to 2025, you may not understand how big of an issue this is for like left, right, center, particularly young people. They believe there was much more to the Epstein story, and as evidence comes out, a lot of like the areas they were questioning have come to be true. So, what are some things we know? I should say from the outset that when we talk about the Epstein files, there's DOJ files, which are about 3 million have been released, but there's at least 3 million that have not been released. There's also financial records that we've still never gotten that have never been released. And the Epstein estate also has files as well. And then some news websites, some news outlets have also received files that were hacked and leaked from different people, among others, Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel. So I talk about the Epstein files. It's kind of all of those, but a lot of what we have is missing or redacted. Uh, to your point, it was Epstein was widely believed by online audiences to be part of some blackmail operation. They believe he was luring powerful people in to compromising sexual situations that could be used as leverage against them to extract policy changes, money, what have you. Because as of now, Epstein, with the so-called sweetheart deal in 2007, 2008, and Ghislaine Maxwell, his longtime partner, they're the only ones who've gone down for any of these crimes related to Epstein as of now. It was known that Epstein was trafficking and had sexual predilections for young women, and Ghislaine Maxwell aided in that. But interestingly, the government has maintained that there's no evidence he was trafficking to anyone other than himself, despite what we've seen in the files. Now, what do we know in the files? You brought up intelligence. Epstein had clear communication with U.S. intelligence. He really had what looks like some conversation with Russian intelligence, and he was trying to get himself closer to the Russians. But he had a very long-standing relationship with Israeli intelligence. Particularly, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak and him were good friends. Epstein, would use his connections to get Ehud Barak involved in things like Palantir. Peter Thiel's company was introduced to Ehud Barak via Jeffrey Epstein. And then we see in the files a lot of investigations from confidential human sources who argue that Epstein and Alan Dershowitz and Donald Trump were compromised by Israel. In the case of Dershowitz and Epstein and Maxwell, the confidential human source said they were Mossad. In the case of Trump, a confidential human source said he was compromised by Israel. Uh, so back to your where you started this question about the media. The media has been comfortable talking about uh, Jeffrey Epstein's sex crimes, but then they note, rightfully so, that just because you're in the files doesn't mean you're a part of the sex crimes. And so far, that's true for some people, but they're missing a larger story here, which is it's not just sex crimes. It looks like Epstein was involved in insider trading. In fact, there's an investigation in the UK to that right now. Looks like he was also involved. It was something with drug trade as well. He was the focal point of a 5-year investigation by the DEA that came out as well. He was also doing what we can only describe as favors because of the redactions, but favors where he was, getting like $15 million from very wealthy people like Leon Black, or Les Wexner, the head of the Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie and Fitch empire. And Epstein had built this web that of close ties where he was able to extract wealth and influence. And like I mentioned, the intelligence community, very close to the political class, from Donald Trump to New Mexico politicians to Virgin Island politicians. He was heavily embedded in the news media. He had a lot of contacts there. In fact, they would reach out to him sometimes for information, and he would influence things they wrote. He was very heavily involved in big tech. A lot of connections there in terms of moving money and introducing people. And he was very heavily involved in academia, point blank, particularly Harvard and MIT, but also individuals like Dartmouth and Baylor and elsewhere. Of course, Noam Chomsky's drawn a lot of attention, but also Larry Summers and dozens of other academics were in Epstein's orbit. And one thing that comes through in the emails is Epstein was a trusted go-to source for information and power. So everyone in power knew he had these like connections and this influence. But now that he's deceased, they all say they knew nothing about it, and they only had like this vague relationship with him that was business. Even though the emails tell a different story, the media has started to take up some very, I would say, some serious investigations, like New Mexico Ranch, which we could talk about. There's some investigations there, and the media has been leading the charge on that. The New York Times did a great piece looking at his doctors. MS Now has done some, and CBS have done some really good stuff and looking into the inaccuracies about his death, which many conclude was a murder. But all of these questions are largely avoiding those who are in power. We're not seeing an attempt to kind of take down the powerful. It's still about putting the Epstein story together versus holding people accountable, especially compared to what we're seeing from places like, Poland, the UK, France, Norway. They're being much more aggressive and taking this seriously than the US seems to be.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me because when I asked you the question, it was actually a bit tongue in cheek on my part, referring to the non connectivity to other issues. Because during lockdown, for instance, I thought the pandemic people were a bit going too far. And since then, I have to say, I don't think they were far off. I think I was further off than they were. I was giving the benefit of a doubt to reason and to humanity, where those ideals need to be thrown out the window if you're a despot. The Epstein story is just wild because when you think back to he was at one of New York's, if not the number one, it was one of the top schools where people send their kids. And the guy was in the halls of a school. This was not that many years ago. It wasn't like it happened in the 50s. And he's got access to the most elite families with children in New York City, right there. No questions are asked. What were his qualifications to be in a school in New York City?
That's the thing. He didn't have the qualifications, and why he left is somewhat mysterious. And the person who headed the school was actually Bill Barr's father, and who was former OSS. And that's interesting because Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, who was a big media mogul, it's basically accepted at this point that he was Israeli intelligence. He got an Israeli state funeral when he died under mysterious circumstances in the 1990s. So for all the people who say Epstein's not intelligence, it seems to be everywhere in his life through every connection. He's like the Forrest Gump of the intelligence community if he's not intelligence.
Yeah, an excellent way of putting it. Definitely. You've criticized intellectuals like Chomsky for defending figures like Woody Allen or meeting Epstein after his conviction. How does prestige function as a form of propaganda to protect the elite?
Yeah, the Chomsky one is honestly it was a hard one. Chomsky had major influence on my work, and always was graceful and giving me endorsements and things for my books. So it was not an easy thing. I'm not some like Chomsky hater who came out ready to swing on him. I think the part that was particularly galling, and we see this with a lot of people, not just Chomsky, but also Howard Lutnick and Elon Musk. When their associations with Epstein originally emerged, they all said like, "Oh, I only met the guy once, didn't really know who he was. It was for tax purposes." And then you get in the files and you see they have this really close relationship where Chomsky, is not only taking advice from Epstein, but he's helping Epstein. He's helping Epstein manage his um, public persona by teaching him how to manipulate media, basically using what Chomsky taught so much of us to do to criticize media, how to use it as a weapon to resuscitate the image of Jeffrey Epstein. Um, and it's this is Chomsky doesn't really, the excuses I've heard from academics don't make sense in general, but they really don't make sense for Chomsky because one of the things, if you work in higher ed, this, that, they say, quote unquote, publish or perish. That necessitates securing funding. And Epstein did use his funding to get into people's orbit, not just academics. And then once he was in there, who knows? You'd be going to lavish parties, you'd be living a different lifestyle, and you become a different person. But Epstein seems to have entered Chomsky's life when Chomsky was, exiting MIT, when he went to kind of do his last, swan song out in Arizona. Chomsky did not need funding. He wasn't doing funding research. Supposedly, it was for estate planning after his wife died, not the wife he's with now, his previous wife. But it really just doesn't make sense. But one of the things that comes through with like the images of Chomsky with Bannon and others and his letters, Chomsky just seemed to be really attracted to power. He was impressed that you could hang out with Epstein and Epstein could get anybody on the phone. Chomsky talked about that. And I think, this is the age old, how many, we've been saying this for centuries. We write books about this and we have fairy tales about this, but power corrupts. When you get a taste of that power, it's difficult to give up. And it seems like Chomsky at some point, maybe always, maybe I was naive, but at some point got a taste of that power. And a lot of the ethics and morals his work seemed to indicate became secondary as power just became all consuming.
Yet I have not read where his involvement is in the files. I started to look at the files in a very cursory manner. I'm somewhat hesitant to do so because he also had a great impact on my life. And I'm very aware that Chomsky is someone who's very open to dialogue with people. I met him the day after 9/11 virtually. I wrote him an email. I was freaking out watching Italy implode. I was living in Bologna at the time, and I wrote him, and he wrote me back within hours. And he was very generous in his analysis of what I was expressing because you saw immediately within a day Islamophobia sections in bookstores here, but it was all called Women in Islam, as if that's what bombs are going to solve the hijab problem, right? We had a back and forth that continued until his stroke. I know that even though he's someone who taught us to analyze the media in a certain way and who took in enormous amounts of media, I mean, the first question that went through my head was if anyone would have known about the 2008 charges against Epstein, it would be Noam Chomsky.
Mhm.
And it's a hard one for me. But at the same time, I'm telling you this story because I'm very aware that he's also good hearted. He wrote me back. He didn't have to. Loads of people write him. And he's kept relationships with people like with me because he's very interested in that exchange. And I've read many articles that have assessed Jeffrey Epstein's climbing the walls of power. And he latched on to people like Noam, people who weren't necessarily extremely wealthy, but who had that cultural cachet that Epstein used to get wealth, just like the girls' school. Of course, everyone knows teachers in New York City are not making a killing. He made a killing, very likely, we don't know. And I really don't know if I can stomach these files, so I just looked through a bit. But I think that this person went all over looking for people in the same way that Bernie Madoff scammed people. They go to who they go to because it serves them. And maybe Chomsky was naive, even very likely, about this person. See, part of my problem with the Epstein files, there are so many that, like you pointed out, that aren't released. This is a little piece of a very large iceberg. And when I say iceberg, I'm not talking about Jeffrey Epstein. I'm talking about child trafficking, the raping of children, and trafficking of humans, not just for sex. There are loads of humans trafficked right now. I said on the show the other week, how many men are held captive on fishing boats in various parts of South Asia and they are forced to fish for days and days and days. They're literally captives. So we really need to start to think about human slavery all over again because it's been rebranded, renamed.
Yeah, yeah, and like, I think it's a good point about how these patterns reemerge. To me, it kind of just takes the mask off the international empire. This is a group of elites who kind of see the world as their playground. They're able to travel all over the world, do whatever they want. It's not everybody, but some folks in these emails. I mean, they do talk about women like they're ordering a pizza, like an object of some sort. And you really see the dehumanizing effect that the trafficking has, and the way in which these folks are talked about. Um, and there's the way they're talking about what to me, especially like torture and trafficking and insider trading, the way they talk about these things, it would be like the way you and I would talk about setting up like a coffee date. There's just such a sense of being above the law and having immunity and no accountability. And so I think that's part of the story of power that we've seen for years and years and years. What I think is also interesting is to see folks like Larry Summers who are engaging in sexist attitudes, talking about how women are not as intelligent as men, who's talking about how to extract sexual favors from a grad student, and Epstein's being his quote wingman. But you also have Epstein in a lot of these files talking to academics, and he's really interested in like gene code editing, what amounts to eugenics. And at one point, he's even saying, "I think we could make black people smarter," indicating that he thinks black people are naturally dumber than whites. This kind of racism, sexism, and exploitation. This is from also like a political class which touts its own virtue, that it's supposedly above those things, right? That you just got to be like the college educated elite. We're smarter when it comes to race. We're smarter when it comes to gender. We're smarter when it comes to sexual relations than you like idiotic working people with your racism and sexism. You need like these corporate trainings. behind the scenes, these people just totally weaponize those virtuous ideas. They don't live them in their own practice. I think that's also something that comes through in the files as well. It's just how much of that is weaponized against working people.
This is the other side of it. We're pummeling a country with this DARVO that we initiated, by the way. It's self defense. With logic like that, then we can claim that 9/11 was self defense. I mean, this is insanity. We can all see it. So they're making this claim. Israel had no problem instigating an attack last summer, and the US carried through on that as well. It makes you wonder who's running the country, really. Is Trump taking all his cues from Netanyahu? More to the point is we've got clerics, we have leaders, not just in Iran, all over the Muslim world, who are very aware that this scandal is the death of Trump. Apparently, there is information that has not been included, that has been redacted about Trump. So, and Trump, remember, doesn't know any of these people, and it could or could not be. However, you've got people in a part of the world who hold childhood and children as precious. And they're able to leverage this within their own populace as a kind of political point because we're up against people who traffic children, who rape children, who live in a way that goes against our values. This is really got all the makings of a kind of holy war from the American empire and from Israel. We're trying to impose our democracy on these people. They have elections in Iran. The Shah we put into power many decades ago, he didn't like political parties. This is something the
Mhm.
corporate media is not telling people. Legacy media completely represses everything about the Shah and his son. Somehow the son is like a Dairy Queen now. We can just franchise power. The same thing with the BBC telling its reporters not to use the word kidnapping to refer to what we did to Maduro. What did we do? Invite them to Club Med? What was that? That's kidnapping. So now we're in the field of all of the legacy media has simply behaved as the Politburo for the United States. It's their press office. That's it.
Yeah, that has been a longstanding practice, certainly in the United States, where the BBC is no stranger as well. It's little things like when they decide to use words like regime or empire, little differences like that. But to your point, I think there has been some kind of shift in the United States, or maybe I'm being optimistic here, but um, I think a lot of the generation alive now, or enough of the generation alive now, remembers the 2003 Iraq War, and Trump really kicked off this war with really only about 30% approval rating. Usually in the US, presidents lie to the public to get it up to like 70%, then they launch it, and a couple years later it gets down to 30%. He didn't do that. That same poll I referenced at the start of our talk today about how over half the country thinks Epstein had part of the reason why Trump did this. um, the country's about split even on whether or not this is more for Israel than the United States. That's also like an amazing poll, and it illustrates your point that half the public feels like this is more about Israel than the United States, and the media like will not touch that issue. Now, to your point about Netanyahu, yes, I think Netanyahu is probably the voice of it, but Trump is also compromised by the money. I mean, Marianne Adelson is a huge Zionist, and she's given tons of money to him, and so Trump is also controlled by that money bank as well. Of course, APAC funding in the United States is also a major influence in our capitalist society, and even if the Democrats took back power at the end of this year, Chuck Schumer controls the Senate, and he's one of the biggest Zionists in the Democratic Party, and then you got Hakeem Jeffries in the House, also a major funder as well. So those are reasons why it's in place for Israel's interest to be over the United States. But I think what takes the cake is what Marco Rubio said shortly after the strike. He said, we knew Israel was going to strike. We knew when Israel struck, Iran would strike back. And so we wanted to strike Iran before Iran struck back, essentially admitting like we let Israel lead us on this. Trump tried to walk that back, but even his walking back um, still made it sound like what Rubio said was true. Trump tried to say like, well, no, we may have made Israel join the war. But and then Caroline Levitt said, well, we had, reason to believe this was going to happen. And Trump had a feeling that was based on facts, whatever the hell that means. And So I think there's a good reason why people believe Israel is controlling this. And the Trump administration has not given the United States public a reason for why this war had to happen and why it's in the interest of the United States. Say what you want about previous presidents, and I've made a career studying history of critiquing the lies of previous presidents, but they at least like straight lied to your face with some reason why it was good for America and convinced people on false pretenses. This president didn't even do that, and I think that's why you see the public just sort of concluding like, look, this has to be for Israel. There's no US interest here whatsoever, and it's happening in the midst of the Epstein files, which are showing how much foreign influence, particularly Israel had on people like Jeffrey Epstein and the people he was connected with. So I think it makes sense in that. And then lastly, to your point about the redacted content against Trump, there's a really interesting story that came out this week that the FBI said that about 3 years ago, federal servers were hacked and the Epstein files information was accessed. They didn't say much more than that. But to me, that could be read a couple of ways. One, they're trying to get ahead of a story that's going to come out, if maybe some international actor is going to release the files. Or it could be a warning to Trump or anybody else like, look, this information is out there, just so you know. It is out there. Someone has it. And so you should behave accordingly.
I've thought a lot about the Adelson connection because I know that had a big participation in his being able to run for president, pay for that, and win.
Mhm.
Is it overstating it that she still has the pull in the sense of he has the power to be like, thank you for the donations, but I'm not moving in that direction? And another question, as I'm asking you this question, is it even legal for presidents to take any kind of funding while they're in office, even if it's ostensibly for the next election? I would think that would not be allowed.
So, so two things. I mean, some of this is obviously going to be speculative, but on the legal front, yeah, they can give to your campaign, and we have some campaign finance laws that are pretty bad. But what Trump has done is opened up a whole new genre of ways in which you can buy the presidency. So you can donate to his public library fund. You can, invest in his kids' businesses. You can invest in a business tied to a cabinet member. So there are all these ways that Trump is making money off these connections. It's a big scam to the Trump administration in terms of the White House. Now, is Trump and Miriam Adelson still seem like they're in communication? Uh, could Trump just take the money and give her the middle finger? I guess, but if you know she has that much money, that much power and influence, that money could easily be used against you if you don't do what she says. That could be to fund another candidate. That could be fund an effort to impeach him. I think he, Trump was, indicted on like 94 felonies. And we now say like, oh, it was a nothing burger. He didn't get put in jail. Yeah, but like to have your world rocked by 94 felonies and those potential implications shows you what power can do, even to someone like Trump. And I'm sure he wants someone like Marianne Adelson not funding efforts such as that. So I think that's kind of where the speculation comes in: is what else could be done? What else do these people know? Trump probably has good reason to do this. Part of it is profit making, but like the Epstein files kind of reveal, you have leverage on like all these people in a lot of ways. And as the public has shown, just association with Epstein can be enough to get you to lose jobs, right? Like Catherine Rumler, her close relationship with Epstein cost her job at Goldman Sachs. Larry Summers' close relationship cost him that at Harvard. Trump's relationship has to be, if more of it was brought to light, I got to imagine it could be very costly in the court of public opinions. There's also those like levers they can pull on people as well.
The fact that he's engaging in this very bizarre invasion of sorts, of bombing now, but talking about boots on the ground and so forth, of Iran. Of course, the first thing I thought is because it happened like this: invasion, kidnapping of Maduro and his wife. Kidnapping happened obviously on the 3rd. But then when we came down to what happened in Minnesota, then it was followed very quickly by this piracy in the North Atlantic. And I'm thinking, why are we pirating ships? Weren't we the ones criticizing the Somali pirates? But then that got really weird coverage in the mainstream media. I don't know if you noticed that Saturday is when they started talking about Iran again. So I'm thinking, is this all a media stage to keep us very busy? We're so busy looking at everything, we don't have time to think about one thing.
I do think that. I mean, that's always been Trump's move, flooding the zone. I would just throw in your timeline. Don't forget Greenland as well. That was also in there as a
That's
distraction.
right. That's
Um,
right.
but yeah, no, I think that's always been Trump's goal, is to kind of control the media and the attention. I think I had mentioned Epstein, but you brought up Minnesota. Minnesota was another big hit to him. I mean, he's led on immigration for like 10 years. People who believe immigration is an important issue lean Trump. That changed after Minnesota for a multitude of reasons. So he's running from that. I mean, he's still trying to tweak. Now he's got rid of Kristi Noem and he's going to put Marquayne Mullen in there. So they're still running from that. But your media question, and this is something that maybe international audiences intuitively know but don't know now. The United States media system is controlled by a handful of corporations, about six, but probably more like four or five very soon. And they report 90% of the media. We have about a handful of corporations that control internet traffic, and usually their algorithms privilege those legacy media outlets. So we have alternative media and good reporting, but it's difficult to find unless you know it exists. And those corporations long ago, I mean, this is 20, 30 years in the making, they started saving money by cutting overseas bureaus, cutting small market bureaus, putting in way more opinion and punditry over actual reporting. So the American public's knowledge of the realities of American foreign policy is pretty dismal in a lot of respects. And even the media that go there, like when Iran is bombed or Israel is involved in the war, they go to like the capital and they stay at some like nice hotel where the military officials are staying, and they talk to like PR people. Maybe they'll talk to a couple people on the ground, but it's really rare. And if it is, it's the types of folks who are in the city. So it's a much more kind of metropolitan look at these wars. So we don't get a lot of reporting. Like right now in the United States, Trump, is claiming that we're winning the war. It's almost over. But if you look at the international press, I mean, Israel has gotten hammered really hard. There's questions about how long Israel can take the kind of sustained attacks on Israel and how long it can maintain its attacks. Iran does not look like it's wobbling or ready to give up. It looks like it's moving to a new phase. There's a widespread belief amongst reporters that the reason why the 12-day war ended is because the United States and Israel wanted to give Israel more time to build up its interceptors, and the United States as well. And then they came back and hit hard again. And I think you keep bringing up Venezuela, and I think it's a good analogy here, because I think Trump thinks he can do a Venezuela, which is, well, we can hammer him, we can kill a leader, and then it'll be over when I say it's over. Iran learned a lesson from the 12-day war. They're not going to let it end, because if they let it end, they know what happens. Then you guys go build up more of a response. You come back and fake diplomacy until you attack again. And so I think this is totally spun out of control. And the, I guess, irony of it is some of the people who predicted that were a lot of the military generals who started leaking right before the attack on Iran, like, hey, this is a very, very bad idea. And we see now the Trump administration kind of flailing. They're pulling out defense tools they have in South Korea, which the South Koreans are very upset by, but they need them for Iran. It's going to trying to tap into oil reserves to calm the markets, but that failed, at least as of this morning. So I think this is you see a president in way over his head who's taking orders from people who do not understand the reality on the ground, and a public is really it's not even necessarily misinformed, it's uninformed about what is going on in the world and what they're paying for.
Yeah, I read similar reports to what you're saying now because the US not only didn't build up enough of its stocks, Iran seems to know this. And it's
Mhm.
assumed that Americans watching the media that we have the better army, we have the better intelligence. Who's to say? And let's go back a few weeks before, because with the protests in Iran, there was good evidence that the Iranian government itself presented that these were not autochthonous organic protests at all. So we've had an operation in advance of what they're calling a war, what Iranians can only experience as an onslaught of terrorism.
Yeah. Yeah, and you even had Israeli officials, during those protests, admit that they had, quote, "people on the ground." So it's pretty well assumed, and I'm sure I agree with you, to your point, it'll come out that we were trying to foment that rebellion. But again, just on top of that, like the Iraq War from 2003 was an absolute disaster for the world. It's an embarrassment for the United States in a lot of ways. Not necessarily because our military is not strong. Militarily, yes, the U.S. military is probably the strongest on earth, no doubt. But you can't perform a regime change and make people like you and engender a democracy through war. And we seem to forget this lesson like every 20 years in this country. The thing with Iran is it's much bigger. It's got 3 times like the population size of Iraq. And it's a way more technologically sophisticated country. I mean, I think a lot of Americans were shocked when they were looking like the rubble on the ground in Iran. A lot of those cities look like places you would find in the United States, and I think that also that imagery is catching a lot of U.S. people off guard. I think they think of the Middle East as like desert and guys in caves and things like that, but that's nothing can be further from the truth. And so I don't think the American public really understands like this is going to be a very long war. There's no way Iran, any regime, but no way the Iranian regime can let this stand. You killed their leader and bombed them indiscriminately, and the school children, of course, things like that. Like the public is going to want retribution for that. And this is just going to be a very long war. And it's not going to be easy. And victory, I think, it's going to be an undefined term for everyone. There will be no victory for anyone in this war.
It's looking very grim. And it's looking even grim because I read a report that Trump was considering, or maybe he has already, warning about alleged attacks on the West Coast of the US. And are people even aware that the drones that Iran has been using, they produce themselves? They've got
Mhm.
quite an industry that is not dependent upon anything that the US could threaten or embargo or sanction. So we're here with Venezuela. What happened on 3 January? The threats to Mexican president and Cuba, should anyone try to give them fuel. That country's undergoing huge stresses right now. Their sanitation, water, obviously electricity, obviously transport, everything's shot. The United Nations does little to nothing except offer word salad, like the infamous Macron speech mid September. Great words, or even all this talk about Carney's speech. I'm thinking, we've been saying that for like years. Like, you didn't need to be Canadian Prime Minister to say duh. So it's like, I think 2026 will go out as the duh year because it's just sort of coming to fruition. A lot of things that people have been saying in media analysis, even certain journalists, we see the propaganda, and Americans especially are getting a taste of it because a lot of Americans are too young to remember what happened with Noriega. I wasn't. I also
Mhm.
was working for the Sandinista government when I was teaching at the university in Nicaragua back in the very end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s. People are now, from their mobile phones, seeing the dead in Gaza, seeing a genocide. They could tune in to Genocide Sudan. They could tune in to a lot today. And so they're seeing that the words and the actions don't match. The US likes to talk
Mhm.
about democracy. We just bombed a country that has various political parties that holds elections. Yes, it has a supreme leader, but if that's the bar, what are we doing about Denmark or Great Britain? Or it's just ridiculous. And then the racism. This is a huge cut and paste from post 9/11. The Islamophobia is just
Mhm.
revolting. The way that I've seen feminist groups applaud the killing of people in Iran is mind-boggling. They've put the chador, as is always the case. The chador is the issue. Not that people are dying, but we can't see their faces while they're dying. Oh my God. So the propaganda's really thick. And you and I, we talked before, you came on the show of the second season. And we talked about identity politics as well. And feminism brings up this kind of superficiality of identity politics because it really is. You want to bomb people because of a face covering? I mean, oh my God, on the one hand. And then you have this kind of sanitation that's gone on. And you've talked about this, the sanitation of presidential abuses of power to make a war seem legal or to seem like a moral necessity rather than a violation of international law. You've talked about this. As you said, the country's split. Our country is split. But many people elsewhere are not split. And people in the global south, they've seen it. They see it all the time. Where they weren't surprised by the kidnapping of Flores and Maduro. They're not surprised by this. But what is the answer when the most we're going to get is Carney and Macron and nothing more?
Yeah, I think, well, I would say to that that, like, you're I mean, no dominant ideology ever comes clean and admits it's wrong and apologizes. The way you start to see that is when you see fractures and they can't maintain the facade anymore, and I think you just listed a bunch of those examples, like, Carney, Macron, like, their their speeches, like you said, are nothing revelatory. They're common stuff we would probably talk about if we were, just BSing. But the fact that it was said at the UN, I think, illustrates that they're finding it difficult to keep the facade up. I think there's also that with the way the U.S. has reacted to this war. I think the media system and political class are finding it difficult to keep this facade going. I've even heard, surprisingly, some whispers from like Democrats, mild critiques of Israel, never like the entire Israeli government. It's just like this government, Netanyahu. But even those things, again, very tiny, but those to me are always like little cracks I see that they're basically admitting they can't keep the facade going. And to your point about what the UN referred to as genocide in Gaza, uh, the fact that like young people, I think that was a massive wake up call as well to the vapidness of identity politics. Because like I've always said, like the identitarians, they're so obsessed with the diversity they can see. It conceals the homogeneity of the ideology behind it. That these neoliberals, whether they're black, white, Mexican, Jewish, doesn't matter. They supported the Zionist uh, goals in Israel and then the goals of the Israeli government in Gaza. And this was the effort against that, in part, was led by young people on college campuses. And remember who these young people are. These are the ones who are told, like, you are the virtuous future. If you go to college and get this college education, you're going to be empathetic and respectful and cosmopolitan, and you're going to change the world for peace. And this is where like the good people are. And they advertise, and I teach at UC Santa Cruz, right? All the advertisements are about the 60s and how students stood up, and this is a campus where you can promote change and transform the world. And then look, they did it. They created encampments, they pushed back, and they got steamrolled by the very same university who marketed that crap to them. The political party that they were told was the alternative to Trump's fascism, the Democratic Party, and these police forces, and the finger wagging was turned around on them. Instead of college kids kind of wagging their finger at all the racists and sexists, they were getting a finger wagged at them for being supposedly anti-Semitic, even though groups like Jews for Peace were leading a lot of the encampments. Um, so I think those are important factors in how you start to see kind of the dominant narrative breakdown, and we're seeing that generationally. We're seeing these different contexts, but you bring up the important question, which is the so what do you do about it? Because Trump's strategy seems to be one of just scorched earth. He's just going to do one thing after another that the establishment has always wanted to do. Take out the Iranian government, take out the Cuban government, take over Mexico, etc. But without the kind of public support, he's just going to try and do these things. And I don't know what situation that leaves us in, but I really think there is an opportunity here while it's breaking down to hopefully turn this thing in a different direction.
Well, I wonder what that would look like at this point because it seems that legacy media is doing an excellent job of giving Americans the impression that we're kicking ass, that they're suffering
Mhm.
and they're begging for, it's like they've screamed uncle 5 times already. When you start to read the reports, you realize that apparently Netanyahu is considered to be perhaps not in Israel at all. He's escaped. This is a theory. I don't know
Mm.
if this is confirmed, but people are saying that Israel has been pounded that hard, that there was worry for his safety. What does this lead to? Because everyone is watching Rachel Maddow. Yeah, I mean, it didn't matter. The Steele dossier, the Russian gate, everything that that woman says is just mythic. People still tune into her. They want to see some kind of confirmation that they haven't made a mistake at the voting booth, perhaps. Others just want, like myself, for this to end because this is not going to end well for even the finances of people. The middle and the lower classes are going to pay for this war. Already, petrol has risen over $100 a barrel.
Yeah, and some estimates I saw are that some people are predicting we may see $200 a barrel, which would be insane. But I saw some economists talking about that at some point. Yeah, it's especially going to hit the middle and working class economically, but it's also going to be in terms of lives. If like I said about Trump thinking he can just kind of end this when he wants, that's really naive. It's going to persist, and I think inevitably troops are going to have to be on the ground. We've already heard that a lot of military are being moved into place, and this is going to be yet another American generation that has to like learn the hard way that when you are kind of asleep to what's going on in the world, or even if you're up to date based on US media, you're going to find yourself in a situation you don't fully understand where the train is already moving. And what that looks like in terms of things like, I don't know, is there a draft? How many thousands of people die on the ground? I think those are questions another generation is going to have to wrestle with in terms of costs, in addition to the high costs of just food and fuel and other things that are going to come from this war.
And then, of course, the loss of life. And this is something that I don't think people are really considering. The active personnel in Iran in the military is over 600,000. Reserve personnel in the US, 800,000 plus 1.34 million active personnel, but they're not all going to Iran. In fact, Iran would outnumber us.
Oh yeah.
When you add their reserve personnel, you're almost at 1,000,000. So I'm just very concerned that the disinformation is so thick. You've had the fake news detection kit emphasizing identifying producers and purposes. Um, how can a regular citizen apply this to a 30-second clip about Iran or a foreign strike? Because this is something that we're seeing a lot of fakes lately in terms of
Mhm.
images, especially since Maduro's kidnapping. I noticed that major media outlets were running fake photos and not knowing that they were fake, because whenever we run photos, I'm very careful to check it out. And so I noticed that they were running AI stuff. How can people know what's true or not? Because obviously, Iran has excellent media, but it's in Farsi. Most people don't read or speak Farsi. So, how can people understand fake news detection kits?
Well, I think asking a lot of questions is critical. Something we've explored on this show. I mean, if it is indeed U.S. media, I would basically assume you're getting a pro-U.S. sentiment, or at least an apologetic U.S. sentiment from it. Ditto with Israel, and ditto with Iran in the region as well. Nations outside of the conflict can sometimes be ones to gravitate toward, just for a different perspective. I would try and stick to reporters or sources who are actually on the ground and talking to a multitude of people, not just military officials, not just the political class, but also everyday people on the ground and their experience. And compare multiple reporting like that to each other, and you start to see a narrative that can sometimes build. I will say in the United States and um, in Israel, I think there are outlets that do report critically about their government in some way. Like in the United States, I think Dropsite News and Breaking Points have done some good work, kind of giving a more well-rounded picture of the U.S. And its interest in Iran and Israel. Haaretz in Israel does some critical reporting of Israel that can be helpful from time to time. So I think just balancing the media diet is critically important, and remembering that look at the background of some of these sources. When these sources are tied to the government in question, you should be highly skeptical of that. You should look for as much like independent sources as possible. So, don't listen to like the US sources on how we're doing in terms of like our munitions or something like that. Look at like independent sources that have researched into this, and try to keep a diverse media diet, but also try and cut out the fluff. Like the opinion people and the punditry are just poison. It's amazing that all these like Republicans who were anti-Trump Republicans, suddenly they're back in the good graces because they're touting on Trump and the war in Iran. And these are the same people that brought us into the war in Iraq. These are the John Boltons, the Condoleezza Rice, the Bill Cristols. Their only complaint is like, we don't like the way Trump did it. We wish you would have asked Congress. But the idea that like we're bombing Iran and doing regime change is somehow like a good thing. So I would really stay away from that kind of punditry class. They have a ideology that guides their reporting, and try to find more like independent sources, and also people who know the region really well too, like academics and scholars who understand like the history we were talking about at the beginning, like what happened in the 1950s, what happened in the 79 revolution. Also people who remind you that, like, if this was about nuclear weapons, we had a deal in place 2014, 2015. We could have used that deal. Trump ripped up that deal. Also, that they were, our own military said Iran was at least 3 years, probably 10 years away from a weapon, right, shortly before we attack. So look for those kind of like independent sources who know the history and know the region, not the kind of flashy people on TV who spend their time in New York and just come to the story like this week.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. I was watching Piers Morgan, and he has made a kind of circus out of the subject at this point that goes a few steps beyond what he was doing those first 2 years of Gaza. And not the, do you support Hamas? Yes or no? Just answer the question. Now he has that Canadian Iranian woman
Mhm.
who has spent a New York second in Iran. I've blocked out her name because now when I see her, I'm like, is this the Gong Show? The woman has no credentials. She's breathing, so she has a brain, and she goes off. It's very theatrical. I think the Kardashians would be better. Honestly, they probably know
She
more.
looks like kind of a Gilda Radner character, doesn't she, from like Saturday Night Live or something?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, it's just wild to watch. I'm getting used to the way, even though I do appreciate, if there's one thing I appreciate about Pierce Morgan is that he has changed his views on Gaza, but it took him 2 years almost to get there. So now we're at this point of a lot of people believe, like you said at the beginning of our talk, that Jeffrey Epstein was the reason for this war, that it's a deflection. Not everyone can detect fake news simply because people are working 3 and 4 jobs now to pay for the next rise in petrol prices at the grocery store, etc., etc. Life is going to become even harder, and it's already hard for people. You have there on the West Coast, and you're in the Bay Area. Oh my gosh, the homeless situation. And how is this being handled by our future President Newsom?
it's it's not. The homeless are, in Newsom's mind, objects to be removed when any important event of his liking comes to town. Yeah, this I mean, to take it to kind of U.S. politics, it's amazing because you and I could have been having this conversation 4 years ago about Joe Biden. The economy is getting worse, and yet he's telling people we need to spend our money on Ukraine. Here's Trump, like the economy is getting worse for people, and we need to spend our money on this attack on Iran. The Democrats, I have no faith in the Democrats. I mean, they can always rescue defeat from the jaws of victory. But one of the things it really frightens me, and this seems to have been a trend since the late 1970s in this country, is the Republicans move further to the right, and the Democrats run on how the Republicans are bad. Then they get in office and maintain the country where it was when Republicans left. And then they reminding people why the country sucks, and then Republicans win and move the country further right, and the cycle goes over and over again. And I say that because the Democrats right now, they're just running on the idea of not advocating for any policies, but just not being Trump. And we've seen this show before. You then get into office though, and you don't actually change anything. Like they've just now found this word affordability. They're like, yeah, man, things aren't affordable. I think that's a popular message. It's like, too bad Bernie Sanders didn't mention that to you in 2015. But their affordability is a goal. It's not a policy. So what are you actually going to do? Like you brought up homelessness. Like, are you going to create pathways to housing for folks? Are you going to create more affordability through like higher wages? Are you going to tax the wealthy so they can't use their wealth as a mechanism to control policies that come at the expense of working people? Like those kind of bold steps are never mentioned by the Democrats. They're hoping that just Trump will be such a disaster, which isn't a difficult thing to hope, that they'll get back into power. But if they don't do something, transformative with that power, it'll just be like the Bush years, where during the Trump years, people had the audacity to say, "Well, he's worse than Bush." It's like, well, who's going to be worse than Trump? How much further do you want to go down this before you offer a substantive alternative?
Well, that's another problem is that from the quote unquote left, but the liberal Democrat non left, these people hold a second version. I called it TDS version 2.0, the Trump derangement syndrome keeps them from seeing the systemic problems afoot. We cannot blame Trump for everything. I'm so sick of saying this, but we have a political heritage that we have to attack, not a single president.
Mhm.
And the TDS folks, oh no, if I have to hear them, they're to me worse than the Republicans at this point because they have the power to move the ball, but they don't want to because they want to gripe and moan about the orange-haired president. And then, of course, on the right, well, I have to say, I'm going to say something very good about the right, at least those who fell into this category. And I think this is largely to do with the screen and watching a genocide on your screen. But the younger generation of Republicans are not really into genocide, nor are they into the support of Israel. And for the first time in my life, I'm seeing a decline in the US. I would even guess that the support for relations with Israel are much higher in the UK, where I initially thought it would be the inverse, because I've lived and grew up in the States and especially the Northeast, and you see those connections.
Mhm.
And you see that many people, even on a personal discussion level, will conflate Zionism and Judaism because that's their choice, but they don't see that there's anything but that choice. Fair enough. But when that becomes politicized, and now you and I are
Mhm.
guilty of breaking the ILHR, guideline of it, and I'm like, what? I didn't get that memo. So now, but it's amazing. It's like when they redefined what COVID was and what a pandemia was and what everything's being redefined so that we can just play word games. And I do not know if you read The Postmodern Condition, but Jean-Francois Lyotard talks about language games very much in this way. And Baudrillard certainly talks about the kind of reality that we're living in. Who would have thunk it that he would be a future teller? But we're in a very strange time. And you've talked about the inverse of what I've just mentioned in the sense of you've pushed back on the rage bait. And you've talked about how the Trump administration utilizes rage bait to keep the public in a state of constant emotional reaction, preventing calm. But when you don't have calm, you also don't have critical analysis. Could you talk a bit more about this? Because we're seeing this ramped up.
Yeah, it's rage bait is stuff that gets you to react, and true critical thinking takes time. It takes so you can process. Often takes quiet, so you can focus. And that's not what rage bait. It's just about reacting and emotional. And our bodies can't be in a state of fight or flight all the time. We're not evolutionarily created to do such a thing. And the other thing is, and this gets back to your point about losing meaning, if everything means something and that something means everything, then nothing means anything. Everything can't be a 15 on outrage. If everything's a 15 on outrage, there's nothing really that has any meaning. And I think we've kind of, and this is more of a critique of like the center left, really fostered an idea that to pass the purity test, everything has to be your number one issue. But then nothing is your number one issue. You make no traction on anything. And with the shifting, as you pointed out, the shifting like language on what things mean, and we end up in debates over language versus actual like substantive policy. You have no kind of resistance to the powers that be. You're just being led by the nose. In Gaza, for example, we weren't talking about a substantive debate about whether or not the United States should continue to fund Israel for what Israel's doing on the ground in Gaza. Instead, we ended up in a debate about whether or not you can be critical of Zionism while not being anti-Semitic. It was word policing 101 on these campuses. So I think those are the kind of things. But Trump is a genius at finding those issues and tapping into them. And there's a degree of it with Iran. Like whenever Iran is brought up in the news, inevitably, all the American commentators they have to do this little qualifier before they even make the slightest critique of Trump, which is, "Look, I know it's I told it was a bad regime, and we a bad guy. We wanted him out of there, but like they have to say that beforehand. They couldn't just like have a critique of the president. You have to like show that you're ideologically aligned with where the powers are before you're allowed to make that like tiny little critique. And I think that type of policing it really ruins any substantive debate because I'm personally from my perspective like everyone in power probably shouldn't have power. I don't like anybody having power over anyone. So the idea that you have to say this qualifier about some but not others, it's just like a mechanism of control and how we think about these debates, and it communicates to audiences of like, well, maybe I don't like the way Trump did it, but he was a bad guy, so I guess whatever. Six, half a dozen of the other, I can let it pass.
Right. And I'm just thinking of the original language game from a person in power. It was that depends on what the meaning of is. Clinton, remember?
Yeah, yeah.
We're there. You wrote about the militarization of media literacy recently by organizations like NATO. How does this protectionist pedagogy prevent students from questioning US Israeli strategic interests, therefore?
Yeah. Um, so I come from the critical media literacy school, which we're different than the protectionists. The protectionists think that like media is the problem and people need protected from it. Where critical school, we think media has power dynamics in it, but media can be a source of good. It can be something that informs you. You can create things that change the world. And even if it's media that has like a negative message, you can interrogate that message and use it as a form of empowerment to kind of recognize like where your enemy or stands. NATO, uh, well, I should back up. The kind of fake news moral panic that emerged after 2015, 2016, which I sort of describe as I wrote my book, The Anatomy of Fake News at that time. And the big critique of me was like, I don't know. He really doesn't like say anything too new. And that was kind of the point of the book, was to say like, look, guys, nothing changed in 2015, 2016. Bad actors have always created false content. They're only making a big deal out of it now because they have a competitor, and they are like the legacy media and the establishment figures. They started to realize there was competing messages, particularly in the digital space, that were undermining their ability to control thoughts in the US. And so they went on this onslaught against so-called fake news, which really turned out to be just an attempt to censor and weaponize critics, left, right, and center, of US media and the establishment. And uh, in that panic, and those efforts, that was part of a global effort. The NATO, amongst other global organizations, we saw this during COVID as well, from like the UN and others. They want to be able to control information, and one of the ways you do that, ironically, is kind of taking um, my solution to fake news and using it as a way to further ensconce fake news, is through education. I always argue as a critical scholar, like a critical education, studies show, can help people better separate fact from fiction or understand framing and spin when they're looking at news content. NATO's position was, we need to create a media literacy that aligns with the goals of NATO. Basically, how do we convince young people that kind of NATO's neoliberal world vision is the way to understand news? So this isn't about true and false per se. It's about ideologically framing content, and they talk about it, not only in the report, which was written by the Center for Media Literacy, but also in a series of webinars. And we did some research in those webinars and the Center for Media Literacy and its report. But yeah, basically what they want to do is create an education that's more like an indoctrination of what sources and perspectives are appropriate and which ones are not. And they want to do it arguing that they're trying to further democracy and peace and global integration and multiculturalism. But the reality is, it's a lot of social justice language around a very militaristic approach to education.
Yes, I remember we ran one of your pieces that I believe it was a NewsGuard. It's phenomenal how in that era, 2022 was a very big year for this proliferation of think tanks or agencies that made sure, checked fake news, and it was pretty ridiculous in the end. Whatever happened to some of these places?
Oh, it was, man, I was right in the center of this. So you had all, yeah, like you pointed out, they saw that there was this moral panic over fake news and a belief that education could be part of the solution. Of course, as I mentioned, the way they define fake news would be different than the way I do it, and the way they define education would be different from the way I do it. But you had all these like big donors who saw like dollar signs if they could get content into schools. NewsGuard was one of them, and to give themselves like cachet, they aligned their board with people from like the NSA and CIA and former Joint Chiefs of Staff, and um, it was basically a browser extension that told students which news sites were trustworthy and which ones were not. And when you know it, like all the legacy sources, including Fox News, those ones were trustworthy, but like the alternative ones that critique the establishment were not trustworthy. And like NewsGuard would send these emails to news outlets, and they have to like fill out this stuff about their criteria and hiring practices. And so it was all like self-reported data on how they made their determinations of which ones were trustworthy. But the money wasn't just for NewsGuard. I mean, a lot of like universities use their endowments to create positions. The federal government at one point tried to create a board to spot disinformation that was going to be run by Nina Jankowicz. This was under the Biden years. Protests got that turned down, but Trump basically did the same thing. All of his departments have websites where they supposedly debunk fake news, but they actually spread it. Um, but I said I was at the center of it because there'd be like a lot of publications or um, they would need like consulting, and they would reach out to me because I had a lot of publications in fake news. But usually they would balk at me once we started having a conversation because they realized I wasn't going the establishment route on fake news, even though I'm in the academy and publishing academic books. I wasn't going to buy into like the establishment. So a lot of these places would go so far with me and then eventually turn me down from going further once I would make a critique. And some of them were just directly honest about it, that like, look, we're not, interested in your critique of like this or that. We want to do this for the classroom. And so I wouldn't play ball with them, but it was a lot of money spent. They created like a new form of expertise, or these like people who are getting jobs in like UC Berkeley and other places, or like disinformation experts, whatever the hell that means. And it kind of just really went out like so many things in academia. It was a trend for a while, and then it got replaced by the new shiny thing, AI, around that same time, which is where a lot of the attention is now.
I was remembering, well, I've got to go look back because I wrote many pieces on this as well. But then I moved on to other stories, and I kept wondering whatever happened to that, because there was this idea, even within the Biden administration, that there would be trust. And he opened that office, right? It only lasted a few weeks, if not 2 months. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Of fact checking stories, and that collapsed as well. It sort of everything just disappeared overnight, as if we don't want to talk about our mistake.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think they knew they were going to take backlash from the right. The right had really devised this narrative that the right was being targeted by these censorship campaigns, which yes, the right was, but the left was as well. And so I think what really caught the Biden administration off guard is when they started to get pushback, even from like kind of center left folks were saying like, this really is like 1984ish to have a disinformation board. And then the person they picked, Nina Jankowicz, uh, she had a lot of fumbles, and the way she talked about like politically, she really showed how aligned she was with like the liberal center. And she had like a lot of these like cringeworthy like TikTok videos, and she just became kind of a lampoon target, I think, for left and right. And eventually Biden kind of collapsed under the weight of it. But also that Biden's cognitive abilities, he was so slow at that point. It's not clear that like a Joe Biden who was more together and more energetic could have pushed back. But Biden had a lot of those stories. It wasn't just the disinformation board, where he seems to have things that just kind of like went on in his administration without his attention until it was too late.
Well, that raises other questions, and no one's touching this. I think there might be fears of being called ageist, but why is there no investigation about who was running the country the last administration? Because it seems very disturbing with the very swift cognitive decline that he had. And this is not a personal attack on him, but someone was lying, be it White House doctors or people around Biden. But why was he left to be in power when clearly it was like Weekend at Bernie's?
Yeah, there were a lot of people lying, and you know, I covered it at the time. This predated the 2020 election. When he was on the campaign trail, a lot of us were writing about it, and there was a lot of conversation about it. And what they did then was they had an interesting strategy. One, they tried to conflate it with ageism, like, oh, you're being ageist. And I'm like, no, like it's nothing to do with age. It's what I'm seeing. And then remember, they tried the cover of he grew up with a stutter, and so when the things you're critiquing or questioning are his stutter and brain issues, so you're being like an ableist, and those were kind of the attacks the left used to temper down critiques back then. During his time in office, it was very clear the decline was there, and who was running that administration is a ginormous question. Um, certainly they didn't have him primary, they didn't have debate. Then he went into that debate with Trump and got the floor mopped with him, and he stayed in the race for like I forget how many more days, like 50 more days or something like that. Within those 50 days, I mean, nearly every Democrat, with few exceptions, said something they now regret, saying like, "Oh, I know he looked bad. He was just sick. You should see him behind the scenes. He's running circles." We now know he wasn't, and you have to really look at. And this gets back to my point I was making you earlier about how when the Democrats run against Trump and then get in office and remind people why they wanted someone like Trump. The Democrats had a golden opportunity in 2020 to reset the narrative. They missed the Bernie Sanders moment, which would have created an economic alternative to Trump's economic right populism, which is largely based on culture and immigration, but nonetheless. They had a chance to do that. Biden, at least rhetorically, signaled that sometimes with talking about like New Deal and all that stuff. But then he got into office and his administration was, a disaster from day one. The Kamala Harris pick was a disaster. People forget she ran for president, couldn't even last for the first primary. She was so hated. Yet he put her on as VP. And then she's not a political talent. I grew up in the state of California. She was my senator and the attorney general out here in the Bay. And then when Biden finally couldn't keep the lie going, by the way, it wasn't because the public was upset. The public knew, the poll showed the public knew he was in decline. It was Democrats who kept lying. Democrats started falling one by one, asking him to drop out. Then the big issue was the donors. When George Clooney and the big donors stopped giving money, Nancy Pelosi realized this is going to trickle down and kill our congressional races. And that's when she pulled the trigger. She says she let him decide. But then they threw Harris into the race. And look, Harris is not politically talented, and she was on a truncated timeline. And people ask, why does that matter? Well, in the United States, typically you have a primary, so people can go out and make mistakes and refine their messaging. She did not have an opportunity to do that, and she did not have good messaging. She supposedly Biden asked her to do this, but regardless, she made the decision to defend the Biden administration, which was getting hit not only on the economy from a lot of its voters, but also from the young people over the Gaza issue, which she wouldn't let Palestinians even speak at the Democratic convention, but she would let Republicans and billionaires like Pritzker speak at it. And it killed the party and allowed the rise of Trump. And the media, this is the kind of final part of all that for folks who remember. The media, they didn't report on it like it was a serious issue. They kept saying like, well, I don't know, they say he's fine, he just jumbled some words. And then Jake Tapper, after the election with Alex, blanking on his name, comes out and writes this book about how all these people knew Biden was in cognitive decline, and they wrote a book on it after the election.
That's right.
Like people, and it's like
And
people
he
need to
has
know
a
that
job.
before the election. Yeah, like
I mean, remember Jason Blair?
yeah,
That not good. Judith Miller, good. Jeffrey
yeah.
Goldberg, promotion. It's phenomenal how our field, media, is considered something very integral to democracy because we're supposed to be that wall which takes everyone to task. And it's destroyed. I mean, legacy media is the Politburo of the White House. I think to a large degree, the same is happening in Canada with the CBC, the BBC. We see it all over the place. BBC is a joke. And when I say the BBC is a joke, I'm talking about what we can see online. Obviously, there are people who love their Radio 4 and their soap operas, and this is not a critique of that. But I'm talking about actual news coverage is bad. They still can't say the word genocide. I've had several genocide experts on the show. The consensus was, as they all have told me, that as of last May 2025, there was an agreement this was a genocide. It finally came to that. And the media doesn't report it. And this is where Epstein becomes very useful to distract the crowds. And we're not going to be able to see what's happening in Venezuela. They're just doing a curated visit to a prison in Brooklyn. That's all. Everything is twisted. So even the media framing of the spectacle and outrage to frame the Gaza conflict while omitting the historical context of the occupation, it's rare that you'll see any news person in legacy media again that talks about the history. So most Americans, I don't know what they're teaching in high schools these last 20 years I've been out of the country, but when I went to school in 5th grade, I came to the United States. The SALT Treaty happened a few years later. I'll remember that part. We weren't really explained anything about Israel except this is where Jews went. This is New Orleans, public education, after World War II to safeguard them. So there was no question of the people who lived on that land before, and the media still does not clarify this. And in fact, the most obvious thing, the genocide in Gaza, is being occluded by all these other stories because Trump might want to make an offer on Greenland any minute.
Yeah, no, historical context is difficult to find in U.S. media. I will say, just kind of anecdotally, obviously, I talked to a lot of journalists and work in the press, and it's really interesting that off the record, most of them know the history you're talking about. They know the realities of Gaza, but they, stop short of fully explaining to me why they couldn't keep their job if they admitted it. And so, they've even told me at times, they're like, this is why we go to quote unquote experts like you, because we want you to say the things we can't say. And the way we look at it is, if the expert doesn't say it, then we're not going to put it in. So it's really on the expert to say it. And I think that's where you get to the problem with like these establishment sources, folks in like higher ed and Harvard, who Epstein was connected with, who won't say these kinds of things. So you get like Alan Dershowitz, who's a rabid Zionist, hugely tied to Epstein. And in one of the files we have, this was back, I think, in actually 2006, probably when you were exiting the country. One of the first academic papers was about to come out from one of Dershowitz's Harvard colleagues, and as well as John Mersheimer. I forget where Mersheimer was at the University of Chicago. And it was one of the first papers that was ever going to come out on the Israeli lobby in the United States. And Dershowitz and Epstein, we have their emails, were working behind the scenes to figure out how to kill the paper. And ultimately what they were trying to do, what they eventually did, was remove like Harvard's name from it, and so it wouldn't be as prestigious and taken as seriously, and tried to get it from any like leading journals. But there were these efforts within the academy to kill information production. So it's not just like teachers aren't teaching it or we're not putting in the curriculum. There's also an interest in like higher echelons of power who unfortunately control a lot of the knowledge production in the United States to kill such stories.
The weird thing about everything that happened with Iraq too, from the very beginning, WMD was declared the raison d'être, behind the motives for going to quote unquote war. But anyone, and I mean anyone with a modicum of knowledge about Middle Eastern history or politics, knew, and many people, everyone living in these regions, by the way, knew this was bullshit. So we had a whole no, but it's amazing that they've been able to pawn off again. It was WMD, but fentanyl variety with Maduro, right? There is no factual basis for that. And then when they got him into Brooklyn, they had to sort of toss out the Cartel del Sol because that was made up for them. There was no actual link there. And they made up a lot. So the powers that be are not held to account. The US, our government can act with impunity, and it knows it will never be held to account. We either negate it through our veto power in the UN, or we do not give credence to certain international courts, and we laugh it off. The same thing with these arrest warrants for Netanyahu and others.
Yeah, I totally agree. I look at things just like historical trajectory. There was no real accountability for Watergate. There was no real accountability for Iran Contra during the Reagan years. No real accountability for Bill Clinton blowing up a friggin' aspirin factory. No accountability for the lies of the Iraq War, not to mention the torture scandal and others. No real accountability for Barack Obama's drone program and including killing a U.S. citizen overseas. No accountability for the Trump administration killing an Iranian leader during his first term, a military leader. No accountability for Biden in Gaza. No accountability now for Trump. I mean, it's that cycle, and it builds and builds and builds. And one has to wonder, in like an alternative universe where democracy was of, by, and for the people, if you held someone like, say, Richard Nixon accountable, like, how much different would history be? But I think each successor president recognizes that they have impunity in a lot of ways because the next president will always do what like Obama did to Bush, right? We can't look behind. We need to look forward. We're not going to go back and deal with that. It's like, well, I study history. There's a good reason to look backward sometimes so we can change what forward means.
Absolutely. And I keep telling people who are angry about ICE that this is nothing. This is actually nothing. Killing a few people, easy peasy. They disappeared 14,000 Muslim men between 2001 after 9/11 for the next 2 years. Where were
Mhm.
you? You did not care about ICE because it did not affect you. And I get a little annoyed about this kind of purity posturing about immigrants. I was sent by people on the other side of this equation some of the literature that was being given to people, and you have to let us know if you're being kidnapped. So I'm like, wait, this is what the left is doing? It's calling it kidnapping and using vehicles as weapons and blocking traffic. I mean, this is never going to go well, not in our country. No. I began to really ask questions, had a few shitstorms on my Facebook page, but I am earnestly alarmed on the one hand, both by what's happening outside of our left right controversies, but also I don't want to be part of a left whose go to operation is going to be to hyperbolize in the other direction. We need to start talking across the aisle. And that was the gift that COVID gave us, where we were able to have dialogues across the political aisle. Because, as you well know, while Jacobin was writing pieces pushing lockdown, you had people like Tucker Carlson who were asking questions about the poor. So I started to see, wow, those people who are ostensibly on the right aren't that far to the right if they're talking about poverty and how people can't afford to eat and how they are afraid to leave their homes because of the masks. And I just feel like so much has opened up in the digital age, even though I loathe social media. I love the fact that it creates these silos. So you get a lot of chatter that's completely destructive and a distraction, even within the spheres of, let's say, only Twitter or Instagram or TikTok. I try to use those spaces as advertisement for the podcast and the magazine. That's it. Try to go in, get out. And I don't want to miss having interesting discussions with people on these platforms. But we know now, since many months, that Israel is promoting people to spread its propaganda for 7,000 a pop, apparently. That might be up or down, who knows now. So we know that everything is smoke and mirrors. And this raises serious questions for our democracy, since we know that even Google has the power to affect elections. This has been proven. If you've been following that scientist who's
Mhm.
not so far away from where you are seated at this moment. So we've got really good data on the influence of big tech. And at the same time, we don't have any laws to demand that their algorithms be made public, that we can see what's being told and done to us algorithmically. And I think there should be that on the table, because otherwise, we're living in a techno bureaucracy with absolutely no civil rights. It's just facade.
Yeah, I think, well, I agree with a lot of what you said. And one thing I'll say that I've been kind of preaching because I share a lot of what you said about COVID. Um, I think most human beings, at least in the United States, but I'm sure that's true around the world, I think they're embarrassed how they acted during COVID. And I think most people just want to forget it. Like the rewriting of history of COVID is like really funny how people talk about it now versus what I remember people's discourse at the time. But you're right. It did present some interesting opportunities. We should first remember kind of what you're talking about, Tucker Carlson. There were a lot of these so-called frontline workers, these folks who were out there hustling and bustling, delivering the groceries and putting their lives on the line, in some cases on the front of this. But there was also a large group of people, working people, who were home and got to reassess their priorities. Like, it's kind of that dream, right? Like, what would it be like if I was just off work for like a year, at home? And I tell you personally, and I know everybody I talked to agreed with this. It was like, yeah, I got to make a sleep schedule. I got to connect with my partner. I got to spend time with my dogs. I got to like reassess priorities. So there was some interesting, I think, transformative potential in there as well. But like everything else, it comes at a cost. And the digitization of everything is just as you described it. It normalized people that their homes are now a place of constant surveillance. We have these devices in there. Smart equals surveillance. So those things are in the house. And the it occurred at a time during that fake news panic we were talking about earlier, where social media really began to change. The moderation, it wasn't just about removing content, it was also about deciding what you do see. And for folks who, started in social media, say like 2006, so like MySpace or Facebook, or if you'll remember Friendster, those social media feeds were about connecting with people you knew in the offline world. Today, that's not the case. Most of the content you see is coming from people you don't know, and it's being targeted at you. Like you pointed out, governments, including Israel, the United States, are generating a lot of that content. Ron, Ron is too. They just put a video today. And it goes beyond just the content creation, right? It's things like Wikipedia. It's, who's editing that? Well, the CIA has, huge infrastructure and ability to edit things like that to tell those kinds of stories. And so we've really handed over, taken away information from, I think, journalists who were never perfect, but did a good job in many cases, to a lot of just random content creators. But and we describe that story as one of like freedom. Right now, you have the power to create content, but ultimately, the algorithm makes the decisions about what content is and is not seen. And that is censorship 101. And as long as these corporations work with the government in power, they will, censor whatever content the government wants them to remove. They were hugely aligned with the Democrats on that when, in the Obama years, when Trump took office, they worked with Trump. When Biden got back in, they worked with him. When Trump got back in, they're aligned to him. It's not Democrat or Republican. They work with whoever's in power, and it's not just in the United States, around the world. They work with all these regimes to tailor their content so they can get access to these audiences for data collection. And Gaza is one of the most uh, clear examples of this, because the only social media platform that wouldn't play ball with the federal government in terms of keeping the narrative that there was not a genocide in Gaza going was TikTok. TikTok, you could see these videos, you could reach out to people on the ground in Gaza. This information was amplified. And what did the US do? They passed a bill to ban TikTok. Senator Mitt Romney admitted that there were people who wanted to ban TikTok because they were China hawks, but they finally had enough votes because of Palestine, because of what was going on in Gaza. That's why they had enough votes to eventually pass that ban, which morphed into Trump's cronies taking over the platform. And that's the reality of the digital era. Yes, you have the ability to create content. Yes, you have the ability to post it, but the platform provider still has the ability to decide if anybody sees it or can access it. The platform provider sets the community standards, not the community itself. And what I think is really scary, and I think it was Julia Schneck who wrote about this, um, the platform decides what's possible on the platform, what you can do, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. So these handful of big tech corporations are socializing the next generation on values. And because this is how young people are communicating, this is all they know. And I think that's a lot of power we're giving over. And to your point, it's with no transparency, it's with no regulation. And these folks have accumulated so much economic wealth. And in a capitalist society that purports to be a democracy like the United States, that capitalist wealth allows them to influence the regulatory framework or lack thereof, which puts really the American people and the users at a huge disadvantage when they try and fight for things like transparency and regulation.
Well, I met with the head of this province's education director last week, and I did so because I'm alarmed at what's happening in schools in Italy to students. In Italy, my daughter's in the middle school. Everything is Google here. They do not teach them to use Dogpile or any of the 100 plus search engines out there. And they're unaware of Google's links to the arms industry or espionage and on and on and on. I didn't sign the form. And I said, my daughter can, of course, do work in the computer lab at the same time, but she will be not using Google. And I'm sorry, I'm a big pain in the ass, I know, but I just find it alarming that they're taking on contracts. Now, Google's making a killing with national government agencies like Italy's. So they can get the Ministry of Education here to sign on. They just upped their fees 3 months ago, if I'm not mistaken. Billions are being raised to indoctrinate our children into a system that were we even consulted? I mean, really, it makes me think back to the 90s. Were we consulted about smartphones? Were we consulted about all this? Because what's happening is a complete destruction of social life. I've seen this, I'm sure you have. And I don't mean about you and I, we work online a lot. Yes, but people who actually leave their computers and go out of their houses and meet people in their everyday, this is becoming a thing of the past for many people, or never a thing for a certain younger generation.
Mhm.
And I'm very worried about these education systems, such as here, that tout the online nonsense without studying or looking at any of the peer reviewed studies, the hundreds of studies that show that the learning outcomes aren't really all that great. We've sold the crack, but we are not able to
Yep.
back up the product anymore. But no one's questioning it here. So my daughter is given a task, an example. I have to look up some art online. What art? Well, we're just supposed to look at art from the Byzantine era, and okay, that's great, but I can find my daughter a website or 12 that says that and shows you exactly where Elvis is living. What does this mean? We're sending kids to just go and find yourself. I've had the advantage of having internet from a later part of my life. When I started graduate school is when I had my first account at NYU. I had access to computers there. I was too poor to have a computer at the time. I was able to do something that was very novel. Who voted for us to all have this technology and have to carry a mobile that people I tried to reach you, where were you? Like I miss the 70s and 80s, right? And I was not at home. Thank you. So now we've got this thing that can track us. We have to be responsible to it. We have to use it digitally. It's taking our biometric data. I've had a back and forth recently with Vimeo because I have a guest coming on the show soon. She sent me her film to watch. I couldn't. Vimeo wanted to not only have my age when I said, you have my age. I created my account over 18 years ago with you where I house my films. They said that's not good enough. We still have the right to. And I said, well, I sent you my ID. You wanted to biometric my face.
Yep.
Yeah. And that, no. And that's happening. And then I wrote about it on my wall. This was just a few weeks ago. And someone said it's happening everywhere now. It's just started. And I'm thinking, no. And yet our politicians, are any of them talking about this? Because now the bar is just being raised on its own and we have no say. And I said to this head of education here, I said, "Are you aware?" And this is going to sound far out to you, but our children's data is being used to model future economies. Think about it.
Mhm.
And he just looked at me like nothing. He just wanted to go and get his coffee.
Yeah, the studies, I mean, you just there's a ton of them, but, there was another one recently that big tech really in the classroom doesn't really change learning in a positive direction, if at all, and in some studies. Um, but to your point about did we get any consent? No, we don't, but we live with the, impact of it. So there's just a study out now that Gen Z or the first generation who on tests are showing less cognitive abilities than the generation before them. A lot of people are believing that's, and one of the experts said this, tied directly to the utilization of screens in the classroom. Young people in schools right now are a kind of lab rat for big tech. This was true of the computer era and then the smart device era. And right now, for young people and like the AI era, we don't know what it's going to do to their brains. I mean, the early studies we have are not good, to say the least. But to your point about big tech power and collecting biometric data, and it's, they ID you. Typically, we think of like if you're asked for an ID, with the exception of like a bartender, it's usually by the government, right? It's a police officer, it's to go to court, it's to get like a marriage license or something like that. This we're seeing happen is the slow integration of big tech becoming the replacement for government in a lot of our decision makings, at least here in the United States. And this is because a lot of government officials are neoliberals from the 1970s on forward in this country, and they believe that everything would run better if it was run like a corporation. And so they believe that things like government, even with the best intentions, getting involved in regulation is going to negatively impact the economy. And so they've let companies in general, but big tech in particular, consume so much power, and its decision making has become so normalized. And I always push people to look at like some of the early writings from Silicon Valley as it was founded as part of the military industrial complex. You can go back and look at like Whole Earth Catalog. Big tech is really anti-human. It is predicated on the idea that humans have a bunch of bugs that tech can fix and tech can do things better. And through innovation research, we can improve upon the things that humans only wish they could do. And this morphs into a very dark anti-democracy ideology that we see expressed by people like Curtis Yarvin, who's a philosopher of Silicon Valley, or Peter Thiel, where and God, Mark Andreessen, all these people were big influences on JD Vance too, where they see a future where democracy is gone, because again, democracy in theory is of, by, and for the people, and people are full of bugs that need to be fixed. They want to see much more of a technocratic future where big tech is making all the decisions. They literally talk about replacing the president with a CEO. And so for them, it's not too surprised to see them rallying around Trump, because Trump has, already put an executive order in place banning all regulation on AI. He's put an initiative forward to get AI in all the schools. And he's just a huge giveaway. His presidency is a huge giveaway to big tech to deliver on that dystopian future. And I think you really have to ask yourself, what impact is that going to have on young people? Like I said, the early research we're seeing on AI in schools is really bad. It's showing a dearth of critical thinking skills, a dearth of memory, and yet it's being integrated all around from the highest echelons of academia all the way down to like the poorest schools, as the promise that like if they get with AI, that's how we're going to lift them out of poverty and prepare them for the future. Even though again, AI is not AI, it's large language models. But I think that's kind of the dystopian future that came to mind when you made that comment about how we're preparing them, we're using their data to prepare them for a future economy.
Yes, and the data even from before AI, but just screen time is
Hmm.
depressing, including not only learning outcomes, mental health. It's quite bad for health and well-being. Sleep and mental health has been linked to use of technology, physical health risks that include digital eye strain and myopia. Myopia has gone through the roof in
Hmm.
recent years. Social isolation, and that's my biggest worry, is social isolation. Because do you remember back in the day, this was 15, 20 years ago, you saw more articles about road rage. Well, I actually think there's a link between road rage and what we see of people's behavior online. And there's so much anger that is unable to be expressed productively because people are actually not having social lives with other humans in real life. Everything is being mediated across a screen. That's not going to go well for our society.
Yeah, we're starting to see some of those outcomes now. I mean, I saw some studies like that. It's like 40% of young men have never gone up to a person to like ask them out in public. A lot. We also see this, FOMO, this fear that people are missing out on having fun. This depression, particularly amongst young people. They think everybody else has a better life than them because online it looks like that. Um, Also, just this fear. The phone is treated as a safety mechanism, and so the risk taking or getting too far away from like your parents, those types of things are those kind of rites of passage. We're not seeing happen either. Things like driving, that people are putting that off longer. Young people are, which for my age, like literally on my 16th birthday, I wanted to get behind the wheel and go anywhere other than where my parents were. Those kinds of things, those kinds of things are just not happening for young people now, and we don't know what kind of society that's going to develop. We've also seen a reduction in like sexual activity amongst young people as well. Not that sex is everything, but it's a form of connection that humans have done throughout all of human history. So I think those are without seeing those social connection points, that really kind of I think talks where your question's at is, what does a future look like when the community doesn't have any sense of community, when it doesn't have any sense of social life? Can you even have a democracy when people are that isolated? Is it even like possible? I think those are some of the fundamental questions that we've kind of put ourselves in here by just uncritically adopting big tech everywhere and thinking, this like techno chauvinist attitude, like, well, tech can fix it. I'm not sure that's the case. And like a lot of these young people are like now depending on like AI bots and things to talk them into like choosing like who to date through online platforms and stuff like that. Like this human experience of taking risks and making mistakes and learning from mistakes is totally being deleted from the society. And do we end up with like just kind of Dunning-Kruger on steroids, where these people know nothing but acts like they know everything, where they don't build up kind of like the resistance antibodies to deal with the realities of life. And so every little hardship becomes like a disastrous, traumatic experience. I don't really know what you end up with the community after that.